Welcome to Inside Forbes with me, Sally Mousa, as we take a look at the biggest lists and stories of the June edition of Forbes Middle East. And yes, we are definitely going big with this one as we unveil the MENA region's top 100 listed companies. And so to give us the inside scoop, as always, we are excited to have our managing editor, Claudine Coletti. Claudine, good to have you back.
Thanks, Sally. Nice to see you again.
Love this. Now, this is our 11th annual ranking of MENA's top 100 listed companies. We are taking a look at the region's biggest public entities. But this past year, Claudine, really hasn't been without its challenges, has it?
It hasn't. So for this list, we look at MENA's biggest stock markets and the biggest homegrown public companies. And we look at the value of their sales, profits, assets, and overall market cap. And what we've seen this year is that pretty much all of those numbers have decreased, not necessarily by huge amounts. So sales are down about 5%, profits by about 13%, but it is a decrease. The last year has not been particularly easy.
So in the list this month, we are still seeing GCC companies dominating with 92 entries, led by the UAE with 32 companies, followed by Saudi Arabia with 31. But of course, there is that one Saudi company that will always be at the top.
Absolutely. Aramco is number one, obviously. And I mean by heads and shoulders. It has a market value of, it's nearly 2 trillion, 1.9 trillion. No one else comes close.
Absolutely. Followed by Saudi National Bank and the International Holding Company as well. We're looking at the banking and financial services sector as being the most represented as well, with 45 entries, generating aggregate sales of 223.5 billion, 3.3 trillion in assets as well. But energy sector as well, that is being represented by 5 companies in there too.
Yeah, what's really interesting is, there's only 5 companies out of 100, which doesn't sound many, but the energy sector is actually the most profitable of all the sectors in the list. It obviously includes Aramco in there, which contributes quite a lot to those numbers, but that is, it's fascinating.
It really is such a small number, and yet they really represent so much of the wealth there as well. This year, we saw 6 new companies, including the UAE's ADNOC Gas in there, coming in fresh into the list.
Yeah, exactly. It's nice actually to see movement in this list. It's often one where it's the same names coming up all the time. So it's really great to see some new companies entering the stock markets, but also doing so brilliantly well.
So there are some notable fresh entries in there, which you can read all about in the latest edition. But Egypt has its own list where we are seeing the 50 listed companies, the top 50 listed companies there as well. Why is there a separate list?
So Egypt's currency has dropped by over 35% local currency, which, a devaluation of that kind does have a huge significance. So, but it's still a massive market and it has some incredibly huge successful companies. But because of the currency devaluation, they just would not have been properly represented on the top 100 list. So we decided to pull out the top 50 for Egypt. But it seems to be following the same kind of trends. Sales, assets, profits are all down, a little bit more significantly actually than regionally. But again, banking and finance dominates. It's got something like 16 entries out of 50.
Yes. One of the top companies in the region is, of course, NMDC Group, the largest turnkey engineering, procurement and construction contractor that is based right here in the UAE, but they're the biggest in the region. They've seen particularly outstanding growth. Talk about challenging years. They didn't seem to have one. In fact, to the point where our cover star for this edition is none other than Group CEO Yasser Zaghloul.
Absolutely. They had an astounding year. Revenues are up 56%, which is absolutely huge. And I think in Q1, profits were up by about 111%. So that's really, truly bucking the trend. I find companies like this really fascinating. So NMDC used to be more widely known as the National Marine Dredging Company before it unveiled a new brand identity last year. So marine dredging, as I'm sure we all know, involves like gathering up all the sand from the bottom of the ocean and repurposing it, building new islands, building new beaches. I mean, it's fascinating to me how companies do this and how they're growing. So the new brand identity last year is kind of all about making them a real global player. And this is something that Yasser has had on his to-do list since taking the helm, I think about 14 years ago. But they're really coming into their own now. They've got projects coming up, I think, in Malaysia and Tunisia or Taiwan.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's a fascinating story.
It's interesting because, of course, in 2021, they acquired National Petroleum Construction Company, and the businesses were consolidated into one group. Like you said, there was the rebranding last year as well. And I know that Yasser has also had his eye on, very much looking into renewable energy and bringing that and making that a strong part of the group's identity as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the reasons for the brand identity is they're not purely focused on just the marine dredging. They have construction, they have energy, and engineering now as well. So it's, they're really focusing on their different specialisms. And actually, you need to read the story, but he speaks about some of the challenges that he's faced in his time. And he mentions about, having to balance environmental concerns and the idea of renewable energy and marine life, balancing that with the need to get these islands up at high quality, at speed. It's very interesting to hear how they do that.
It is a great story, definitely a must read in this edition. And he's someone, that I've been lucky enough to speak to a few times as well. Someone with real vision and is really looking to the future, looking forward. Our other cover star is, of course, Aziz Aluthman Fakhroo, who is the group CEO of the Ooredoo Group in Qatar as well. He's been leading a new strategy for that Qatari telecom as well since taking the helm in November of 2020.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very successful strategy by all accounts. Since he took over in 2020, so we're talking, barely 4 years, their quarterly net profits have gone up by over 270%, which is obviously absolutely huge. What I find particularly interesting about this new strategy, what they've done quite recently, is they're working with their competitors in a way that creates new revenue streams for all of them. So obviously telecom companies are having to evolve a lot in recent years. Traditionally, a lot of their revenue came from things like SMS messaging, if you can remember that.
I don't remember.
And traditional phone calls. Now it's all about data usage, right? With WhatsApp and Telegram, that's just how we communicate now. So they're having to digitize and they're having to rethink how they grow their business going forward. So Ooredoo is working with Kuwait's Zain and the UAE's Task Telecom Holding to merge many of their telecom towers across 6 countries in MENA. And by doing that, they're going to create the region's biggest tower company with about 30,000 towers between them. And they're going to be renting out the towers and the equipment to create new revenue streams. It's a fascinating new approach.
See, it's such a great strategy because normally all of these separate telecom companies would have this separate infrastructure, incredibly expensive, the upkeep, the maintenance of it, and sometimes it wouldn't even be used. But pooling resources like that just works in everybody's favor.
Exactly. It's working together for the good of everybody. It's very interesting.
Fantastic. Love that strategy as well. Something that's really interesting about this particular edition is that there's quite a focus on women. It's exciting to see. We have a list in here about the businesswomen of the Middle East who are taking their firms public.
Yes. So, I mean, unfortunately, this is one of those lists where women aren't particularly well represented as the heads of the companies. But we always like to have a conversation about women in every issue. We do highlight 7 of the women who have taken their firms public, not necessarily just in the last year, but they've done great work. Especially, I mean, for example, Shaista Asif of Pure Health Holding, they went public December last year, so it's only about 6 months. but they've seen revenues increase by 50% in the first quarter of this year. So already it's having a huge impact.
Exactly. And now this year, they are a new entry into the top 100 companies in the Middle East as well. So doing big things as well. What's really interesting is we are looking as well as gender diversity gaining traction here in the MENA region as well, and featuring all of the data around those countries who are really taking that seriously in terms of bringing women on board in the workplace, on boards, and what that looks like. What does that transformation look like?
I find that this is a really interesting piece, although it's quite, it's not a long article. It's one of our leaderboards at the front. There's so much data in here, and it shows a real positive movement. I'm not going to sit here and say it's all fixed, we're doing great. Obviously, these numbers are still small. But women returning to work accounts for something like $385 billion to the GDP of the GCC. I mean, that's a huge figure, and it could be so much more. So yeah, this piece looks at the countries that are kind of leading the way. It looks into the number of board seats, women holding board seats across some of the major economies. It's a really interesting read.
It's interesting because when we look at PwC, for example, the International Labour Organization is showing us an increase in the level of female participation from 19% to 32% up until 2021 across Saudi, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Lebanon, and Jordan. For us here in the UAE is, of course, home to the most publicly listed companies with the highest percentage of board positions as well for women. So, like you said, these are great gains, but there's so much more to be done as well. And I'm loving that article. I'm loving that we get all of the details there. Speaking of women, there is a woman at the head of Ras Al Khaimah Tourism who is really looking to shake things up and really looking to take on the competition from other emirates.
Yes, this story is really interesting. Ras Al Khaimah is absolutely determined to be a major competitor for its neighboring emirates, especially on the international tourism stage. So it's going to be home to the first casino resort in the region, a $3.9 billion resort that's currently being developed on Al Marjan Island. But that's not the only development that we're going to see. And Ras Al Khaimah, I think, certainly for me and my friends, has always been on the map in terms of staycations for regional tourists. But now it's really trying to put itself on the map to gather those international tourists. And last year apparently was its most successful year yet for international visitors. It had over 1.2 million visitors, I think, just in that 1 year. One of its biggest source markets is Russia and Kazakhstan, weirdly enough, but we have all the details in the story. So
fantastic. It's all there with Alison Grinnell, the CEO of Ras Al Khaimah Hospitality Holding. Of course, Ras Al Khaimah is such a hidden gem for us here in the UAE. We love it for the staycations, but as you say, it really is opening up to international tourists. And I feel like RAK is really working with the other emirates as well to tap into that incredible ecosystem for tourism that we have here, that we're so famous for here in the UAE as well. So expect big things there. Very exciting stuff. Claudine, thank you so much. We're excited to see July coming up as well.
Absolutely. Keep your eyes open.
I know. I can't wait for that one. It's got one of my favorite topics in there as well. We can't wait for it. We will see you in July. But right now, make sure you get your June 2024 edition of Forbes Middle East. It's available right now in print and online.